Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. And I'm the first speaker, so not nervous at all. No pressure. Um, I would like to start by introducing myself. I'm Swati Shrestha. I'm research wheat scientist here at Oklahoma State University. But I have my partner in crime, Dr. Liberty Galvin. She's the extension wheat scientist. We both work as a team. So when we both were talking about what I should be talking about in this session, we just got an idea that a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about herbicide resistance, how it evolves, and those kind of stuff. And it's not only among the researchers or people in wheat science that the confusion is about. It's totally common among the growers, the general public as well. So I would be talking more about the theories associated with herbicide resistance. And in the second part of the talk, Dr. Galvin will talk a little bit more about the research that we are doing and our future plans. So the lesson that I have here, the first question that I have is, what is herbicide resistance? And this entire talk is adapted from Wheat Science Society of America. Also, in this session, I want the session to be interactive as well, because we want to know your opinions on what you guys think of as of herbicide resistance. Before I start, I just have a quick question. How many of you have heard about Wheat Science Society of America? Can you raise your hands? So pretty good number. So whatever I have here is from Wheat Science Society of America. For the people who don't know, Wheat Science Society of America is an organization which promotes research, education, and awareness in weed management. So by the end of this lesson, you all should understand what herbicide resistance is and how it evolves in the field. Recognize the factors that influence the selection for herbicide resistance, and also define different types of herbicide resistance. So wait, before this, can anyone here just tell me what, according to you, is herbicide resistance? Anyone? No one? Exactly. So herbicide resistance is basically not killing the plants that were supposed to be killed by the herbicide. Now, the basic definition that is given for herbicide resistance by Wheat Science Society of America is that herbicide resistance is the acquired ability of a wheat population to survive a herbicide application that was previously known to control the population. Now, the term that I want to focus here is acquired ability. Why the acquired ability? It's because there is the selection of that herbicide that is occurring in that population. And another thing that we need to know about herbicide resistance is that there is the change in the number of individuals in the population over time. And now in this figure, in the year one, there is only one plant that is herbicide resistance. In year two, the number of plant increases. And in the later years, there are a lot of plants that are herbicide resistant. Now, another term that I would like to introduce now is herbicide tolerance. So herbicide tolerance is basically the inherent ability of a species to survive after herbicide treatment. And here, there is no change in the herbicide tolerant individuals over time. So these are the two very important terms in herbicide world. One is herbicide resistance, where there is change in population over time, and herbicide tolerant, where there is no change in population over time. Now, the good example that I can give here is, I am assuming that there are a lot of growers who produce wheat here. So let's say here, pinoxidin was used to control Italian ryegrass. The first year, pretty good control. Second year, a little bit more resistant weeds, but year after year, there might be a lot of Italian ryegrass in your field that are not controlled by pinoxidin. And in that case, we can say that the Italian ryegrass, they have developed resistance to pinoxidin. Now, for tolerance, a good example that I can think of is how many of you have seen morning glories controlled by Roundup? So usually, if you look at the label of Roundup, it says that it doesn't control Italian ryegrass pretty well right from the very beginning. So morning glories are actually tolerant to Roundup because they have that natural ability to not get affected by Roundup. So morning glories are tolerant to Roundup, but Italian ryegrass are developing resistance to pinoxidin. So that is the difference between the term tolerance and resistance. Now, the thing to know about tolerance and resistance is there is no change in population over time in tolerance, and in resistance, there is that increase in population of those resistant species over time. Now, I was saying that herbicide resistance is the acquired ability, but it is a naturally occurring process. The selection is occurring because of the herbicide that you are using, but it's a naturally occurring process because the resistant individuals are present in the population already, but because you are applying that same mode of action of the herbicide, they are just increasing in number. And those resistant individuals that are present are known as biotypes in scientific terms. So here you can see a resistant biotype and a susceptible biotype. Another thing that I also want to mention is that weed control failure does not automatically means that the weeds are herbicide resistant. So what other causes can cause weed control failures? Can anyone think of anything that causes weed control failures except herbicide resistance? So there are a lot of other factors, right, that can cause weed control failures. So if your field has weed control failure, it might not mean definitely that it is resistant. And another term to know about resistance is that resistance is heritable, which means that if you have resistant plants and if they produce seeds, the seeds are going to be resistant as well. Now I have a nice animation on how resistance occurs in the field, which I'm just going to play here. So there is actually 1 in a million plant that might be resistant, and you spray a herbicide. The susceptible weeds die, and the resistant one, it matures, it produces the seeds. The resistant weeds now increase the second year, and year 2 begin with more resistant weed species. Now the same process is repeated in the second year, but there are more resistant weeds in the field already. And the same weeds mature, they produce seeds. Until the year 3, there is a significant amount of resistant weeds in the field. So this is just a general idea of how resistance is developing in the field. But in this animation, when we are spraying these herbicides, the thing is that the grower is spraying the herbicide with the same mode of action. So for that selection process to occur, that herbicide that you are spraying is the same mode of action, because if you are spraying different mode of action, then that weed species might die from different mode of action, and there might not be that increase in the population over time. And how long does it take for the selection of the resistant weed? It varies on and depends on a number of factors. For example, the frequency of herbicide that you are using, the mechanism of action, the biology of weed species, that is the to start with, how many individual resistant population are present in that field, and also the that is the frequency of the resistant biotypes. So how long does it take for the resistant weed species to take over your field? It can take somewhere from around 2 years to almost 10 years. So it just depends on a lot of factors that are in the field, within the weed species, and also the external factors like the herbicide that you are using. Now, once you have the weed species in your field that are resistant, another question is what is the level of resistance? And for this, the answer would be the weed species, the resistant weed species can have resistance somewhere from 1x to 1000x. That means that they can survive 1000 times more the labeled dose. So that is pretty high. Now, why we need to know about this information is that because if you have resistant weed species in your field, looking at the pattern of the injury in those resistant weed species, sometimes you can make conclusion on what mode of actions they are resistant to. And I'll show you how that happens. So there are two levels of resistance. One is low level and another one is high level of resistance. In case of low level of resistance, you can see a broad range of injury symptoms. Some of the plants might be dying. Some of them have just intermediate injuries. And but the majority of the plants, they have that intermediate injury. And in case of these low level of resistance, the susceptible plants will be present in that population. So there are a couple of susceptible plants as well present in the population, especially at the beginning of the resistance. And low level of resistance occur from usually group 9, 14, 4, and 22. So these are the common ones that causes low level of resistance. Now, high level of resistance, as it is mentioned in this term, if the resistance level is high, most of the plant wouldn't be injured by this one. There are a very few plants that have that intermediate injury, and susceptible plants might be present in that population, but they are in very low numbers. And high level of resistance is caused by usually group 5, 2, and 1. So looking at that, you can sometimes tell, depending on how the injury looks like in a field that is impacted by resistant population, you can get an idea of what group they might be resistant to. Now, I want to talk about different type of herbicide resistance. So what are the different type of resistance? The first one is single herbicide resistance. And as the term says, when a weed species is resistant to just a single herbicide, then it is called as single herbicide resistance. Another one is cross herbicide resistance, which means that the individual plant is resistant to two or different herbicide. They belong to the same mode of action, but different chemical families. I think all of you here might know that different groups of herbicide, they have different chemical families. So if a plant is resistant to, let's say, two different chemical families within the same group, for example, group 1, it has FOPs and DIMs. So if a plant is resistant to both FOPs and DIMS chemical families within group 1, it would be mentioned as a cross resistance. Another one is multiple herbicide resistance, which means that the plant is resistant to different mode of actions. For example, Palmer, they are resistant to Roundup, which is group 9. They might be resistant to group 2 as well. So if the weed is resistant to different mode of action, then it is multiple herbicide resistant. And it is definitely entirely possible for one individual plant species to be resistant to different mode of actions or different chemical families within same mode of action. And if it is different chemical families within same mode of action, then it is cross herbicide resistance. So here I would like to give an example of how cross resistance might occur. So if a grower has this weed species where he's applying Classic for the first year, but because of that resistant biotype might be present in the population. This one survives. Next year, he applies the classic, the same herbicide, but the number of resistant individual increases just because this one survived. It produced the seed, and then this year started with higher number of those resistant individuals. Now the third year, the grower decided to switch to first rate. So, but then he noticed that this population is resistant to both classic and first rate. So this would be a typical example of cross resistance because both classic and first rate belong to, does anyone know which group this herbicide belong to? So both of these belong to group 2, but different chemical families. Classic is a sulfonylurea and first rate is a triazolopyrimidine, but both of these belong to group 2, which is an ALS inhibitor. So since in this this figure here, the third year, you have the population that is resistant to both classic and first rate. It is an example of cross resistance. But another thing that I want to point out here is that it is pretty fast for cross resistance to develop, because here you can see that just within 3 years, the cross resistance is developing in the field. Now I'll talk about multiple resistance. So for multiple resistance, here is one example. A grower is just spraying atrazine in his field for continuously for 5 years. So there is selection of that resistant weed species in his field. Here you can see the population resistance to group 5 increases with time. He's spraying the same herbicide from year 1 to year 8. But in year 8, he decides to switch to glyphosate. But you can see there might be some individuals in that population that is resistant to both atrazine and glyphosate. And in this figure, it would be this pink plant. So after year 213, he's spraying the same herbicide again and again in the field. And now, after 14 plus year, you might have some individuals in your field that are resistant to both atrazine and glyphosate. And this would be the example of multiple resistance. So here, I just want to point out that multiple resistance, it takes longer to just, develop and increase in population and field as compared to cross resistance. And this is something we should remember. But also, one thing that drives both cross and multiple resistance is using the herbicide again and again with that same mode of action. For example, here it was just group 5 used for many years, and here it was group 9 that was used continuously after group 5. So this thing tells us that if we try to rotate the mode of actions, it is possible to at least slow down or minimize herbicide resistance in our fields. And multiple herbicide resistance, as I was mentioning, can occur because of repeated application of the single mode of action year after year. So I think this is basically what I have for this first session. But now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the current status of herbicide resistance. But before that, a little bit of conclusion. So herbicide-resistant biotypes, one thing to remember about that is it is the acquired ability of the plants, and the number of herbicide-resistant individual population, they increase with time. And there are many factors in the field that influence herbicide-resistant weeds. And once a weed is resistant to single herbicide, it is entirely possible for them to be resistant to other mechanism of actions as well, or other chemical families within the same mechanism of action, which is the example of cross and multiple resistance. So a little bit, I wanted to go over another slide, which will talk a little bit about the current status of the herbicide resistance, just because to give an idea of how serious of a problem herbicide resistance is. Yeah, the next one. And also, I didn't want to mess up this presentation because it is adapted directly from Weed Science Society of America, where there's a panel which describes what herbicide resistance is. and a lot of other factors. So here I'll talk about history and current status of herbicide resistance. But before, I am not sure. So before that, I wanted to just go over the slide. If we can click this link, I think it will, yeah. It did? Oh, yeah. Or if not, I think my like Dr. Galvin has the same link, so it should be okay. Okay, so this, I just wanted to show this database, which is International Herbicide Resistant Weed Database. Now, how many of you have seen this database? So basically, not a lot of people, but this website has all the updated information on how many herbicide resistant weeds are present currently, not only in the US, but worldwide. So this is a pretty good website to go with. It has this filter data tab as well, where we can go over each state, and it shows how many herbicide resistant individuals are reported in each state. Now, it might not be 100% accurate because there is lack of reporting, but pretty good website to start with. Just wanted to go over this one. Now I think I can start with my slides. So while talking about the history, does anyone here knows what was the first herbicide discovered and when was it? Random guess, when would be the first herbicide discovered? Exactly, it was 2,4-D. Pretty smart. Yeah. So the first herbicide discovered was 2,4-D, and it was marketed around 1950s. It was most commonly used in US and the Canada. And the first case of resistance was reported in 2,4-D in 1957 in wild carrot in Canada and in climbing dayflower in Hawaii in the same year in sugarcane. So from this, we can tell that within just 7 years of those use, the resistance was developed. And does anyone know when was the last new mode of action discovered for herbicides? Around 2000. So it's been almost 25 years that we don't have any new mode of actions. So now I think we have herbicide resistance for almost all mode of actions that we have right now. So pretty serious issue. And after that, as we can tell from here, atrazine, simazine, group 5 were the herbicides that were discovered after 2,4-D. And for them as well, the resistant cases started developing pretty soon, around 1970s. They were used around 1960s, so within just 10 years. And so 1970s, some cases of resistance were reported, but right now, wait, what happened to my pointer? My pointer stopped working. Oh, okay. So right now we have 534 unique cases of herbicide resistance. When I was checking, and this is directly from that herbicide resistant database. When I was checking 2 weeks ago to give this lecture in my class, there were 533. So one more species was added in just 2 weeks. And that's why the herbicide resistance is a serious issue in the Weed Science Society. And also management of herbicide resistance should be taken seriously by all the growers, by everyone working in the chemical herbicide industry. And 273 species are reported to be herbicide resistant right now. And this graph here shows that global increase in unique herbicide resistant cases. Here we can see there were just a few within during 1955 and 1970s, but it increased exponentially in the coming years. And in 2020, after 2020, there are more than 500 unique cases of herbicide-resistant weeds, and this is globally. this graph here gives the number of resistance cases for several herbicide mode of actions. So the highest is group 2, which is ALS inhibitors. After that, it's group 5, atrazine, simazine, PS1 inhibitors. Group 9, which is glyphosate. Group 1 are DIMS and FOPs, ACCA inhibitors. And after that, it's group 4, which is our auxin mimics. So here we can see most of our mode of actions that we use have very high amount of herbicide resistance. Now, in case of US, these are the unique cases of herbicide-resistant weeds in the US. Here you can see around 1970s, it was just to atrazine and simazine, but then it increased exponentially. And right now we have around 200 species which are resistant to herbicides. And this one is for Canada as well. So the number for US and Canada are kind of similar just because we kind of use similar herbicides and we kind of use them again and again every year without rotating the mode of actions. This one is a little bit of the global one. So US is on the top, which is kind of concerning. So the efficacy of herbicide is decreasing for sure. We can tell from this as well. But also after that is Europe and then Australia. But then China, even though it is one of the big agricultural nation, doesn't have that much herbicide resistance. And we suspect that it is because they underreported, which I'm not 100% sure about. But for now, based on the reports that we have, US is number 1. These are the number of resistant species to individual actives. So to atrazine, which is one of the most widely used herbicide, it is widely used in our corn belt because atrazine can be sprayed over the top in corn. So there are 66 different weed species that are resistant to atrazine. To glyphosate, another herbicide that is most widely used, 51 weed species. 2,4-D, 25, which is still a high number. So here we can see that a lot of our actives have a lot of herbicide weed species that are resistant to them. Now, this one is the list of different weed species that are resistant to multiple herbicides. So the first one is annual ryegrass. It is resistant to 40 different sites. And Palmer amaranth, for us, I think we have this Italian ryegrass, which is also resistant to a lot of herbicides. So all of our major weed species, most economically important, most problematic weed species, this is horseweed. They are resistant to multiple herbicides. And that's why we need to think about having those rotations, thinking about different, I think, weed biology and ecology as well nowadays to control the weed instead of just relying on herbicide for weed control. Do I have time for mechanism of action as well? I can go over very briefly on the mechanism of resistance as well. And when I wanted to talk about this because now I think you guys have gotten a good idea of what herbicide resistance is, but mechanism of action, it tells us how herbicide resistance occurs. Now, herbicide resistance is happens when the weed species is not killed by herbicide. And to understand why the weed species is not killed by herbicide, we need to know how the weed species is killed by the herbicide. So does anyone here has any idea about how the weed species is killed by the herbicides? What's that? Oh, so leaf intake. So when leaf intake happens exactly, it can be leaf intake, but in case of pre-emerge, it can be intake from the actively germinating seeds as well. So herbicides are taken up either by leaf or roots or even actively germinating seeds. And then those herbicides, they go to specific site of action, specific site within the plant where they block some kind of pathway, biochemical pathway within the plant, which is really necessary for plants to produce fats, lipids, or photosynthesis. And if those processes are blocked, then the plant dies finally. So herbicide resistance is basically what is going on in the resistant plant that differs it from the susceptible plant. And in case of susceptible plants, the herbicide, as you were mentioning, is taken up by the leaf or root or actively germinating seeds, and they go to these specific sites within the plant. And based on that, we have these group numbers based on what site inside the plant that herbicide is attacking. So there are different sites here, and based on those, if the herbicide goes to that lipid synthesis site and blocks that, then the plant cannot produce lipids or fats, and then it will have that lack of lipid and it would die. So this is the general process that occurs in the susceptible plant, where the herbicide is absorbed by the plant, it goes to any of the specific site, and then it blocks that site. After that, the susceptible weed would die. But in case of resistant weed species, any of these sites might be altered so that the herbicide cannot act on the site. So that is one of the very simple ways by which herbicide resistance can occur. But there are other factors as well that can cause herbicide resistance, but all of those are related to that site of action. And that's why I wanted to include that. So there are two major ways by which herbicide resistance occurs. The first one is called target site mechanism of resistance, and the other one is non-target site. So in case of target site, these are all the different sites that herbicide attacks. But if you have altered target site, then that specific site in case of resistant plant is altered in some way. So there is some kind of genetic alteration that occurs in that target site. So the herbicide can no longer recognize that target site, and then the normal process would occur. And so the individual is resistant. And that is caused by that mutation, which is something genetic that I don't want to go. So here's just that demonstration of how herbicide attaches to that specific site, and then the normal process that should be occurring in the plant doesn't occur. But if the plant is resistant, then there is some kind of alteration in that target site so that the herbicide cannot recognize that target site, and then the normal processes in the plant occur, and then the plant doesn't die because of that herbicide application. So this is target site resistance mechanism. Another one is overexpression of target site. Here what happens is that the target site is produced in a large number in the resistant plants. So even if the herbicide is attaching to some of those target sites, there are a lot of those target sites inside the plant. So the normal process still occurs within the plant. The other mechanism is enhanced metabolism, where the resistant plants can absorb the herbicide, but it is detoxified by some chemicals that might be present inside the resistant plant, which is called as enhanced metabolism. And the last one is compartmentalization, where the herbicide is absorbed by the plant, but it is taken up to the vacuole so that they can no longer reach to their target site. So these are the 4 major causes of herbicide resistance. And I just wanted to go through this so you all get an idea of how the herbicide resistance occurs in plant. And I think this is the last slide for me. I know that I covered a lot, so a little bit of summary. So I just went through the basic definition of herbicide resistance, which is the acquired ability of plant, and the number of herbicide-resistant population, it changes over time. There are many different factors that affect herbicide resistance. So it depends on the different mode of actions that you are using, how frequently you are using the herbicide, and also different cultural practices and biology and ecology of weeds. So we talked about different types of resistance, which is single, cross, and multiple resistance. And I talked a little bit about the current status of herbicide resistant. US is number one to have those highest number of herbicide resistance weed, which we shouldn't be proud of. And at last, I just gave a very brief idea of the mechanism of resistance, just to give you all an idea of how herbicide resistance occurs in plants. So if you guys have any questions, you can just email me or talk to me directly. But now my partner will talk about the current studies that we are doing, right? And also how we can use weed biology and ecology for more effective weed management in the fields. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Oh, yeah, thanks. I'm going to use it. Okay, let's see if I can talk and click and hold this microphone at the same time. All right. Oops. Oh, crap. Okay. All right. I'm going to get going so that maybe we could cut out for lunch a little bit early. My name is Liberty Galvin. I'm the new extension weed scientist here at Oklahoma State. Like Dr. Shrestha said, she and I were co-hired. So we are two parts of a whole weed science pie. She's my technical gal pal, and I'm your field rat. So you will see me out. You'll see her in the lab. It's been really great working with Dr. Shrestha because her genetics background and my applied background are not the same background. And so we have a lot of ongoing discussions about what we think is happening with resistance. We get into a lot of really productive arguments. Thank you, sir. So part of what I asked her to talk about today was based on some of the conversations we've been having over the last month-ish about how resistance happens. People love herbicides. I'm going to talk to you about resistance. Okay. The agenda. All right. The agenda for today, I'm going to give a statewide herbicide resistance report. Dr. Shrestha and I mostly work in small grains. And so that resistance report is mostly from wheat fields. Then I'm going to kind of talk about like, what's the problem? Like from an applied perspective, from a scientific perspective, from a co-op perspective, like what's actually the problem with herbicide resistance? And then talk about major barriers to implementation. A lot of this stuff is from the literature, but it's kind of fodder for you to use when you go and you talk to people and you're trying to convince them to rotate their modes of action. And then I'm going to talk about the research vision. This is not just my vision. This is a weed science program whole. Because Dr. Shrestha and I work so closely together, it's kind of the expectation. When do I get tenure? It's the expectation for the next couple of years for job security. So I'll start with this statewide report. Dr. Shrestha mentioned that that website where you can go and you can find the most updated information on herbicide resistance. So when you go to that website and you filter the data, I clicked on the state of Oklahoma, and this is all of the reports from the state of Oklahoma up until today. Y'all are getting some exclusive access information on the next slide. Something I want to briefly talk about. I kind of baited Dr. Shrestha into that talk this morning and then told her later, I've been invited to sit on this committee through the Weed Science Society of America, because even within our own society, we cannot mutually agree on the definition of resistance, the definition of tolerance, how cross resistance happens, how multiple resistance happens. And this website was previously run by a weed scientist and has now been taken over by HRAC, which is the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee. They have very stringent rules and protocols for getting resistant weeds published on this website. And so historically, people in my society have used this as kind of like oh crap, they have resistant ryegrass in Texas. We better get our act together in Oklahoma. It's up on the board. Now this website is really showing you how deeply one of these weeds is in the hole. It doesn't make it on this list unless it's a really, really bad widespread problem. So part of the resistance screening that Dr. Shrestha and I started last year is we asked for samples from the wheat community in Oklahoma. When I was in grad school, I did a similar screening program. We would get I think max 30 samples a year, which is great. Dr. Shrestha and I got 200 samples sent to us. And I think that is a reflection of the resistance problems in the state of Oklahoma and also y'all's investment in managing resistance. You want to know if you have it or not. You want to know what weeds are resistant or not. But also know that the times are changing and the national society is recognizing that we're running out of chemical options. And that's something I'm going to talk about more in this presentation. Sorry. Okay. So Amna Dar is a weed science graduate student. This was her research and she has a poster on it. So if you want to know the methodology for this particular experiment, I really encourage you to go and chat with her. She's very pleasant to talk to. But her whole master's research was looking at very specifically Italian ryegrass in the state of Oklahoma. We tried to focus on the major wheat producing counties, which are all mostly west of I-35. And we had different growers send us samples. There was co-op folks that sent us samples. We did some roadside sampling. The sampling procedure is something else that we're arguing about within our society. If you pull one weed from one field, does that mean that that whole field has herbicide-resistant weeds? What is the threshold? I think Dr. Shrestha and Amna did a really good job. They collected multiple samples from each field. So when we say we have resistance in this county, that's not just one sample from one field or 5 samples from 5 fields. That's typically a minimum of 4 samples from 10 fields in each county, I think. But your group 1s are your ACCases, group 2s are your ALS inhibitors, and group 9 is everybody's favorite glyphosate. I was actually kind of surprised to see how much glyphosate-resistant Italian ryegrass we found in wheat fields, because you can't spray glyphosate straight onto wheat fields unless you're doing a real fancy spot spray application. It's probably a carryover from summer crop management, but Italian ryegrass loves to become glyphosate resistant. And I know that because of the herbicide resistant database. Okay. And I have friends that work with Italian ryegrass. So here's the most recent update. These were all collected last year. This stuff is not going to be on that database, but I'm going to publish this really soon in a fact sheet. I know that Dr. Manicherry got a pretty big grant to do the screening project. When she was here, Dr. Shrestha and I used our startup funding to do the screening project. So we'll probably revisit that in the next 3 to 5 years. Again, whenever my tenure is up, I'm definitely going to have another screening project on the docket. But having these come out every couple of years, I think kind of keeps us all on the same page. How are we doing as managers? Is the problem getting worse? Are we seeing change, right? So expect this kind of information to come from our group every couple of years. Does anybody have any questions about this before I move on? Okay, and if you have methodology questions, please ask Amna. Please visit with her. So what's the problem? Really, Dr. Shrestha iterated this, and this is a graphic that I made that I'll put in a fact sheet because I think this is an easier way to communicate with growers that don't understand that when you spray the same stinking mode of action year after year after year after year, all of your weeds are going to adapt to that mode of action. The thing that Dr. Shrestha and I went back and forth about was this piece. How do weeds actually become resistant? And I don't have a genetics background. So I really like talking to her about this. And these resistance genetics are present in the field, like she said. They're 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, but they're there because we kill all of their competition because those other weeds are susceptible. But how does that mechanism happen? So a low dose can cause this stress mechanism to turn on and then the plant doesn't die, or it's just naturally tolerant to a high dose. Okay. So later in this talk, I'm going to talk about good stewardship. And part of good stewardship is getting good coverage to make sure that we cook those weeds when we have the opportunity to do so. But really, like, I think a lot of people in here know that this is a problem. Growers, they're a major concern among all of us, but growers are not quite on board. They're like, yes, we know herbicide resistant weeds exist. I think I have them in my field. I'm not sure what to do about it. I don't want to rotate away from wheat. So, but there are some major barriers that exist and they're consistent across the United States. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit and what the literature says that we can sort of use to combat those issues. So the first major problem is techno-optimism. And I think a lot of you know what this is. You've maybe just never heard the term. So techno-optimism is the belief that human-driven innovation is going to outpace any threat to society. Okay. We see that. So we see that with climate change. How many of you are that person or know somebody that's like, I don't need to manage for climate change because it's not happening to me right now. And the economic investment required for me to plan right now for climate change mitigation is not worth it. That's an example of like, somebody's going to come up with some tool to pull all the carbon out of the air and put it into the dirt so I don't need to worry about carbon sequestration. Like, that's a techno-optimism mindset. Now, how does that manifest in chemical weed control? We all know a grower that has sprayed the same Group 1 herbicide for the last decade of their lives, and they most likely believe that there will be a new silver bullet coming to them. However, what have we learned from decades of these individuals spraying these herbicides over and over and over? So there's some really good literature from Roundup, because Roundup was the last unique mode of action to come to us in 1996. So what you see here in this graphic, just kidding. Here's the article. Another thing, if anybody wants this presentation, all of the references that I have, I've linked them. So if you want to read any of these papers, if there's any nerds out there, you want to read these papers, I can send you this PowerPoint and it has all the papers attached. So this particular paper is about Roundup. People thought it was going to save them. All of the crop injury disappeared. All of their weed control dreams came true. But what happened is people really committed to it. And then we saw a huge increase of resistance. So in this graphic, we have our percent control on our y-axis and our decades on our x-axis. Roundup Ready crops were introduced in 1996. And depending on the weed species, we saw on average a 15% decrease in efficacy every decade. So it's almost 2025. It's been 30 years. We've seen a huge loss in that product. And we love that product because we love our Roundup Ready crops, right? But we're losing this technology because we're abusing it. But there is a silver lining. It's not a silver bullet, but there is a silver lining. Something that they found in this study is that they collected all this data, and what they were finding is that when people applied a pre, in addition to glyphosate, which is a post, they saw almost no reduction in efficacy over time. And so there's these little tiny things that we can do when the weather cooperates, right? That will really ensure that these products stay in our toolbox for a longer amount of time. And I also think that a lot of people, this is another like harsh reality to that techno-optimism mindset. Nobody's made a new herbicide in 30 years. And the evolution of herbicide resistant weeds has increased by 500% in my lifetime. That's a lot. And that's because we use it over and over and over. And the other harsh reality that people really, really don't like is the ag chemical industry is not incentivized to make new products. They're truly not. And it's declined. Herbicide discovery has really declined, and it's really freaking expensive. It takes 8 to 10 years to register a new pesticide through the EPA. And the last time a totally new product was registered was glyphosate in the mid-90s. That cost millions of dollars. 30 years later, it's probably going to cost billions of dollars. If the crop that you work in is not bringing in billions of dollars, the herbicide industry is not incentivized to go through this billion-dollar process to put a new product on the market. And people get really mad at me when I tell them that. But this is the reality that we have to work within. There's no silver bullet, and it's not going to come to us anytime soon. Okay, so the next major barrier to implementing herbicide resistance management strategies is it's pretty freaking complicated. But also, we have a situation with the conflicting sources of information. Okay, so this was a really interesting study from some crop advisors that work in soybeans up in the north central part of the US. I imagine many of you who are also CCAs may find your own opinions in this paper, but I thought some pretty interesting results that she found. This is just the takeaways, were major constraints or major concerns among CCAs about resistance. CCAs are aware. It's not that we don't know about herbicide resistance. We know it's a problem, but the grower is ultimately the one who is pointing the fingers and paying the money and making the decisions. But this paper was about what does CCAs think are, from their perspective, what are the growers' problems? Okay, always economics, right? Rotating to something new is super risky, especially if you don't have the equipment. Now you're really looking at an investment. Economics, time constraints, conflicting retailer information, and management complexity. Okay, so what are we gonna do about it? I was writing this presentation, and when I talk about our research vision, I was like, wow, I kind of feel like I'm going to war, and I'm asking everybody to get on my side, because we really need to all get on the same page and start sending the same message about resistance. We need to be really honest and transparent with growers. We're not getting new products, so how are we preserving the longevity of the products that we have right now? And providing unbiased information. So I know there's some industry guys in the room. It's really interesting to me to get these protocols because the trade names are really fancy, right? The trade name is meant to draw you in. It's called sharpshooter or whatever. And you're like, oh, I want to sharpshoot my weeds. That's a cool product. It's still a group 2, right? We really have to be totally clear about what that mode of action is, because what Dr. Shrestha was talking about is once we have resistance to one active ingredient within a mode of action, it is purely a matter of time before multiple active ingredients within that mode of action become resistant. Okay, so when you're like, hey, you need to rotate, are you telling them to rotate from one group 2 to another group 2? Because that's not going to fix their problem. We need to be really transparent about, hey, if you used a group 2 last year, maybe you should use a group 1 this year. And that's a really simple message, right? It's not a super complex message. And I think that's another issue. We sit here at the university and we're like, hey, you need to rotate. Hey, you need to do this, that, and the other. But really, the grower doesn't want a complex message. You know, they have pre's out there. A lot of growers have told me they don't like using pre's because it causes crop injury. And that's something that I'm trying to address. But that product is already there. So I can bait them into being interested to use that product. A wheat grower that has never grown alfalfa before, I'm probably not going to bait them into growing alfalfa. It's going to be harder for me to convince them to rotate a crop versus rotating a mode of action that they've already used before and that they're comfortable with. And good product stewardship. Okay. This whole talk is sort of getting at this foundational message of good product stewardship. So, what do I mean when I say that? We have to rotate our modes of action frequently. And I put frequently in italics because, like in an ideal world, well, there's a lot of things we would do in an ideal world, but how frequently is frequently? Like if you've got a guy that you think, I've really created like a good relationship with this person, but I've only known them for a few years, maybe I'll tell them in 3 years to rotate their mode of action because they won't trust me if I tell them this year to rotate their mode of action. Frequently would be every year. But as someone that works in wheat, I know that annually rotating your mode of action is quite difficult and we're very, very limited. However, working within those limitations, using one mode of action until it doesn't work anymore, 5 to 10 years, that's not frequent enough. Okay. I've also been asking growers like, hey, do you rotate? What do you rotate with? Wheat growers. And they say, oh, I rotate to corn. Oh, okay. So if we are trying to battle winter annual weeds, it doesn't matter what you plant in the summer because your summer weeds don't compete with your your summer crop doesn't compete with your winter weeds because they don't have the same seasonality. So if you're trying to get rid of this Italian ryegrass that really mimics the wheat crop, switching to a different crop is the way that we're really going to disrupt the life cycle of that weed that's in the field. And like I said, that's complicated. But that's part of good product stewardship is how can we figure out a way to not use this product next year? Utilizing adjuvants. During the CCA prep yesterday, I was like, anybody like adjuvants? Everybody raised their hand. Big fans, big fans of adjuvants. I really want to encourage everybody to use those. But beware of snake oil. Okay. I've seen some pretty interesting adjuvants. If it doesn't have an EPA registration label on the front, don't invest in that product. And please don't buy products off of Amazon. Okay. And then good coverage, the last piece of product stewardship. And this is something I kind of sort of am going to try to address in my research. How do we get good coverage? Okay, we got to slow down. We can't drive too fast. Okay. I found a label that says 10 miles an hour. I was teaching in Dr. Stress's class last year, and I was teaching a lab about calibration. And I said, all right, which one of you kids has like a farm operation? How fast do you drive on your operation? And there's this like real sweet, quiet kid that was like, oh, we drive 25 miles an hour. And I was like, oh, that's fast. And then I asked him if he thought he had herbicide resistant weeds in his field. And he said, yes. And I was like, yeah, I didn't need you to answer that question for me to know because you're flying past those weeds. Are they even getting touched by that herbicide? You're creating your own drift at 25 miles an hour. So there's some like real simple things, reducing speed, increasing carrier volumes. I kind of feel like if you slow down a little bit, you could maybe find a compromise on your carrier volume, but preventing drift when you drive fast, you make your own drift. And then nozzle selection. I think there's some pretty interesting stuff about drop nozzles. If you're really worried about weeds that have already come up, making sure you get good coverage from your fan angle overlap. Okay. Okay. And then the last barrier to implementation, it is expensive to manage for resistance because a lot of time that looks like rotation, but there's a really interesting study that was done in 2015. So it was done 10 years ago. They were already finding economic advantages to managing resistance 10 years ago. So take this paper with a grain of salt. Some USDA ERS guys looked at the advantages of managing for resistance, and they looked specifically at glyphosate tolerant crops. So they looked at when you have continuous soy, a corn soy rotation, or continuous corn. They're all using Roundup. Okay. And when you make a little change one year, what they found and the big take home message is cumulative impacts of returns are higher after 2 years than what you lost in the first year. But are you going to convince a grower to take an L in the first year? I don't know. right? Like, and that's the hard part, is convincing growers that like, hey, you're going to get a good payout in year 2. Like, well, what are we going to do this year? Like, okay, that's a good point, right? And I just wanted to emphasize that even more. That's an average. If you grow continuous corn, you're making a lot of money in year 2 compared to year 1. But the other thing too is if you're working with somebody that leases their land, which a lot of folks do, they're also probably not going to change up their behavior because they're leasing, right? They don't want to lose money in 1 year just to manage herbicide resistance in 2 years. Okay. But the reality is, if they make that decision, and some of these family farmers, I think when we saw a shift to no-till, that was us as an extension entity convincing them to invest in the future. So resistance management is, again, it's an investment. And if people don't have the financial flexibility to make that investment, you know, that's kind of what we're working against. They're not going to make a change. All right. So this is the other thing from that paper that I find kind of funny. They're like, okay, well, what does resistance management mean? And they defined it in this paper. And it's, again, good product stewardship, but use glyphosate during fewer years. Okay. Combine glyphosate with one or more alternative additives and avoid applying glyphosate in consecutive growing seasons. It was like, of course, an economics person did this, because how are you going to grow continuous Roundup Ready corn and not apply Roundup every year? So even the people doing the research, they're not out in the field. And so it's hard to find evidence to give to y'all to be like, hey, we need to make a change. Okay, but what are we doing about it? What are Dr. Shrestha and I doing about it? I really think that timing of application. So how do we use the products that we have better? I think a lot of people, they report that they have resistance to us, and they delivered seeds to us for this screening project, and we did not find resistance, and it was quite surprising. And I think when people assume they have resistance because they're not getting good weed control, but then they send us these samples and we find that they're susceptible, that's a timing of application issue. And not only that, I haven't had enough time, enough commute hours to think about how to manage second flushes. And so that's also in my mind, but I haven't had enough spin time to consider that. So, timing of application optimization, and then some competition studies. So I wanted to put this photo on the board. My group and I went out to scout the taps field on the 12th. I think that was last Thursday, because we wanted to be able to report back what weeds we were finding. We found our favorite Italian ryegrass, our little adorable wheat plant over here on the far left, and then some Bromus tectorum, some downy brome over on the right. I really kept this photo in my mind all weekend to formulate the second half of this presentation. And I'm going to continue to come back to this picture. So this is a big question. There was a co-op guy and I that actually had a conversation about this. What is the window of residual efficacy for before a rainfall? So we can't predict the weather. We do our best, right? We have the mesonet. It's actually the gold standard for the world, but we still can't predict the weather. Karina Benetton, is Karina in here? Oh, hey, Karina, stand up. Vanna White for the crowd. No, stand up, Karina. She's doing some really incredible research right now, funded by the Soybean Board, where she's basically doing the same experiment. So I'm going to replicate this in wheat. I think a lot of times as researchers, we're not totally transparent on how the research process happens. So in order for me to do big research, like big money research, I need to have data. So for this particular grant proposal, I'm going to use Karina's data. I'm also going to ask the wheat growing community for letters of support, like, hey, we do need to know more information about pre's. So this is on the docket for next fall. Dr. Arnell and I have talked a lot about soil influences. So how does soil pH, texture, infiltration rates, compaction, et cetera. How does that influence the window of efficacy for pre's? And because we're finding these herbicide-resistant biotypes, are there differences between the susceptible and the resistant types? Something that I have no business talking deeply about, and I will, if you have questions, ask Dr. Shrestha. But resistance is a trade-off genetically. So sometimes when a weed becomes resistant, it has to trade off another trait. And so it may be more susceptible to frost tolerance. It may be more susceptible to drought. So that's one reason why we have this question in here. Not only are we trying to really make sure our product works well, but is it working differently when we don't expect it to, depending on the weed. Another endeavor I'm going to take on is drone use optimization. Sigh. Drones are the future. And I personally, I'm not like a huge fan of drones. I don't enjoy looking down at a screen. However, if we have even a 10% improvement in battery efficiency, we are going to see a massive shift. Drones save people a lot of time, a lot of energy. You can spray when the ground is wet. Seed movement from field to field is obsolete. You also, I told Daniel Adamson, the new soil and water conservation guy, I said, we're really missing an opportunity to look at the economic impact of reduced soil compaction, because when you use a drone, you don't run the tractor over the soil, right? So I think that there's a lot of advantages to drones that we haven't looked at yet, but everybody and their freaking uncle calls me about drone questions, so we're going to get into it. This photograph up here is with our colleagues, this big old boy, and Alex, Justin and Alex. They are aerial land management out of Tulsa. Great guys. They came and did a spray drone demonstration for us at the end of July. They have really shifted from kind of like a contract business to now they're just really dedicated to drone continuing ed and demonstrations, which that was a pretty like dramatic shift over the 4 months that I've talked to them. But I saw them at the Tulsa Farm Show last week, and they're really excited about getting into this research. But nobody knows how high to fly above the canopy. Nobody knows how fast they're supposed to be driving that drone, and they don't know the optimal carrier volume. And so a pretty simple they're like, well, it creates its own downdraft. I'm like, oh, all right, that's, yeah. And when you fly 25 miles an hour, your neighbor gets that downdraft too, you know. So there's some like pretty simple drone logistical application questions that I'm going to try to answer with those guys. But a bunch of people on the eastern side of the state have contacted me about drones because they want to do fence line management and monitoring. They want to do cattle monitoring. When you live in the woods, how do you get over the trees to spray your pasture, which you can't get to with your quad? So there's some pretty interesting functionality with drones, and people are buying them left and right and don't know what to do with them. So I'm trying to establish OSU Weed Science as a source of information for drone applications. Also, timing of application. What am I getting at here? Oh, yeah. So when I dug all these weeds out of the field, my assumption was that they probably came up at the same time. And the more I stared at this picture over the last 48 hours, the less I was convinced of that. But how do we know when to spray post-applied herbicides? Okay, so this calendar year, we had that really warm February. All of these winter annual weeds, just like our wheat, go into a dormancy. So what's the cold threshold? That's my question. Like, at what point is that weed just not growing anymore? Right? And what happens? Where's the CCA guys at? What happens when you spray herbicides on a weed that's not actively growing? Say it loud, say it proud. It doesn't work. Yeah. So if a weed is dormant, it's not actively taking in that herbicide and metabolizing it. So you're not going to have as much injury. So with post-applied herbicides in the spring, when we have wild weather, it's freezing, it's 90 degrees. When do those weeds come out of dormancy? And when can we zap them? Because once we get to the jointing phase, we run out of post options. So we're looking at application optimization for our pre's as well as our post. When do these weeds become their most aggressive? What environmental stressors influence that? And then how do we use what we know about the plant against it? Okay. I'm really into, I did a lot of phenology work in grad school, and that's basically looking at each stage of development of the plant and determining where the weak phase is in that stage of development and then targeting it and destroying the plant. Okay. That's the vision. Does it happen like that? No, but that's the vision. So everybody and their grandma has Italian ryegrass issues all across the world. Italian ryegrass is highly adaptive to its environment. And so the information from Cornell was very different from the information from California. Even our neighbors in Arkansas and Texas, their Italian ryegrass behave very differently from each other. So we need more concise biology studies. However, across all the literature, these are the traits that Italian ryegrass has consistently. So it's highly adaptive. The seeds have a really short dormancy period, just 3 years, which is like such an advantage for us, because things like lamb's quarter, Canopodium, has like a 50-year seed dormancy. So this is an advantage for us, a short dormancy period. They don't like to be buried deeply. Okay. And it's like a 50-50, they'll germinate in the dark. Okay. So what do we do with this information, right? What are our cultural control options based on the biology of the weed? So first, variety selection. I've heard growers talk a lot about late flushes, like they don't really have a lot of problems through the season. And then that late flush is the one that like crushes them. So do we have a variety opportunity? I know Amanda and Brett have been doing a lot of variety selection stuff. So this is another opportunity. Amanda has generated some really, really good data on seeding rate. And so I would like to tack on to that, use that data for one of these big, big grants, and then really determine, okay, we know from a yield perspective, this is the ideal seeding rate. But if these weeds can't germinate in the dark, let's get a really thick canopy up really quickly so that now we've reduced that germination potential by 50%. Okay. They also don't like to be buried very deeply. And that to me is really interesting because yes, it adapts quickly to the environment. I bet our no-till guys have a big issue with this because they don't bury their seeds, right? Italian ryegrass loves to be on the top. Dr. Adamson and I also had a conversation about conservation tillage. When you take tillage out of the combination, mechanical, chemical, cultural, you've taken mechanical off the table. And now you're dependent on chemical. Well, that's what we've been telling you all morning, that we're running out of chemical options. Okay. So can we make wheat more competitive by increasing the seeding rate, maybe a little bit of conservation tillage here and there, and then really changing up our mode of action frequently, because these weeds, they adapt so fast that if we trick them, if we train them to grow one kind of way for a few years and then we switch, they're already adapted to that previous management. And then I really think there's some opportunities. Dr. Silva has been doing some good stuff with delayed planted wheat. I came from rice, which is not wheat, but there's some pretty interesting pre-season management opportunities, not just pre-emergent herbicides, but from a seed bank management perspective, if you induce germination of your weeds, that's a withdrawal from the seed bank. Okay. But now the weeds are up. What do you do about it? If you are planting really, really late, which this year There's some people who are planting right now. That's pretty late. Was there an opportunity after that November rain to maybe do some kind of burn down application and then pump the brakes a little bit until November after that residual activity is finished to go in and do a really dense planting to try to get the wheat canopy up to crowd out all the weeds, right? So this is like, I'm sorry, you're subjected to my thought process, but this is sort of where we're going with this. Like, how do we use weed biology to our advantage? The other big thing that I really want to think about is, can we select for root vigor? Because look how badass this Italian ryegrass root system is. There's a concept in weed science called the critical period of weed control. It's pretty nerdy, and I quite frankly can't decide if I appreciate it as a metric, but it is a well accepted experimental design in weed science. And that basically is, what is the critical period in which weeds must be controlled in order to have reduced competition with the crop? Okay. And most weeds, their critical period of weed control is right when they emerge, because if you have an emerge weed and an emerge crop, the weed's gonna win, right? And look at all that above ground biomass, right? Weeds are hotter, better, stronger, faster than crops. Like that's why they're a problem. So can we look at what's happening below ground to give our wheat a little bit of an advantage? And that might be associated with seeding rate. I'm about to start an experiment in January where we look at a seed treatment. So can we treat the seed to develop really, really dense roots so that it crowds out all the Italian ryegrass, and at the end of the season, we don't see any yield losses because our wheat got as big and bad as the weeds did? That's my general hypothesis. Okay. So I'm sorry that I didn't have a lot of research to present to y'all. But this is the vision. That's the ramble. If anybody has thoughts, opinions, feedback, more than willing to take that. Please send me an email. Please call me. Please find me on Facebook. But for now, I can take questions. Yes, sir. Yeah. He loves the drones. No. And I say that because I actually think that drones are about to. Okay. So am I going to do any comparisons between drones and airplanes? That was the question. My answer is no, but that's because I don't know any airplane pilots. I've been approached by a bunch of drone pilots, so I would not be opposed to making that comparison. I just don't have that connection at this moment. I also think that a lot of the airplane guys are going towards drones because they see the precision of the drone. It's also it's more appealing because you can sit in your truck and drive the drone versus pay somebody that is not as emotionally or financially invested in your property to come and fly it on. So yeah, you can't die in a drone. Yeah, it's just like the safety, the precision. You're right. I shouldn't say that, because if the docking station is on, yeah, more questions. Yes, sir, please. Yeah. Yeah. So in 2017, yeah, that was a long question. I'm such a bad auditory learner too, that I'm like, no, I must answer the question. So really, he asked about like, what are we doing to educate the people with power and influence to make policy, in a nutshell, right? That was your question. Okay. They're corporations, first of all. They kind of don't play by the rules if they don't want to. I worked for a pesticide lobby in Washington, D.C. in 2017. It wasn't my favorite job, but I learned a lot. It's hard to answer this question because I want to be sensitive, but at the same time, they are going to wait until it's financially to their benefit to make these decisions. this WSSA committee that I'm sitting on right now, we had a meeting 2 weeks ago. There's no industry rep on this committee. And it's about 9 people. Me and 2 other people are the only like extension applied weed scientists on the panel. Everybody else is a hardcore researcher, and they have opinions on what resistance is and what tolerance is. And I said, hey, if we go out and we tell someone that this is a resistant crop, and then they spray a herbicide on it and it injures the crop, that company's going to get sued. And so, and this hardcore researcher was like, we shouldn't pander to the industry because they don't make the rules on how we define the science. And I said, that's fine. However, they make the chemicals. And if we as extension and scientists are not on the same page with them, they have more money and resources to spin the conversation however they want. So they have a new product. It's called Sharpen XL. It's still a freaking group 2, right? So that's why, we're trying to get industry people on this committee because we have to all get on the same page. It's difficult to get an audience with those people, but it's also very difficult for us to even have conversations within our society about like, hey, we should include these people because they are the boots on the ground. Like they are talking to growers. And if we don't make friends with them and get on the same page about our conversation, they're not going to change. All right, Mike, take it away.
Oh, just real quick. One thing maybe to add to the discussion is the patent life is 17 years from discovery. If you use 10 years of that patent life, just taking care of the governmental things, and depending on who you listen to these days, it's $350 to $500 million to take a product from discovery to the marketplace, and you have say 8 years to try to get a return on that. That puts a lot of pressure. Not trying to make excuses, but I think that's a piece that's part of it as well. So.
Yeah, Mike from Alba. Okay. Our used to be industry rep, but that's another thing. We as extension people, I'm from the state of Oklahoma and I'm invested in the people in the state of Oklahoma. Mike probably is too, but his paycheck is based on something very different than what my paycheck is based on, right? So part of this committee is we're trying to get everybody on the same page. And something I told Dr. Shrestha was that before I finish this job, I really want to contribute to like label consistency, right? There's some little things that I think we could do to really influence our industry colleagues in a positive way. Nobody in industry likes to talk about product stewardship. And here's Liberty talking about product stewardship, but my job isn't dependent on products. So I also find it a little interesting sometimes. Like, yeah, please, sir.
Yeah. I'm going to get back to your question about how to get the decision makers maybe to make good decisions. And I think you kind of pointed out that you're on an advisory group, and there are people in this room that may be in their career being asked to be part of one of those advisory groups, being whether it's EPA, USDA, whatever. And for the most part, you find those people very receptive to what you've got to say. Now, everybody understands that when you're in that committee, sometimes it's hard to be heard, but at least you're being heard, and they realize that we're thinking about doing X, Y, and Z, and you're standing there going, that's going to be a huge problem out there in the field. And they need to know that, and usually they're receptive to that. So I guess my take-home message is, if in your career, and I've seen a lot of people that are younger than me in this group, to say yes when you're asked to be in an advisory group so that you can have that input for those decision makers, because most of them really do want to do well. So it's only whenever they do bad do we hear about it, and people hear about the EPA and USDA and all the other big entities. their big government bureaucracy, and in DC or even the East Coast, a decision made out there may not work in Oklahoma, may not work on the West Coast. I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you for that. So knowing that I'm on this advisory committee, if anybody has some passionate words they want to share with me for me to pass on to this committee, but I was pretty vocal because these hardcore researchers have ideas about resistance that don't make sense from an applied perspective. You know, they're like, well, so for example, we don't have thresholds for resistance. And this hardcore researcher was like, well, you know, we shouldn't use the label because the label changes frequently. And I said, well, when I'm out in the field and I tell people the label is the law, how am I supposed to tell them that, like, oh, well, it's resistant up to a 3x rate? Well, 3x is not on the label. And so now people get the idea that, well, if I just spray a 3x rate, I'm going to kill it. Well, I just encouraged them to do something illegal, right? So even within our society, we're having a hard time drawing these boundaries and communicating with each other. But I actually think getting our industry colleagues on this committee will help us a little bit more from an applied perspective.
Sorry, I'm walking around you.
I don't want to listen to
any more questions?
Anymore. I don't want to talk anymore.
Dr. Galvin. Oh, no, this is I'm passing around ODAF right now.
I forgot about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just got these in the mail and I brought them for anybody that wants one. So I've been talking about rotating modes of action, but if you don't have the jug in front of you, sometimes like Googling is not the easiest because you have to find the PDF, etc. Anybody is welcome to take one of these. This is all the herbicides that are currently registered and available for use. I thought this was updated, but it still has dicamba on it. So just don't look at dicamba. You could shed a little tear. But if anybody would like this for their office, it has all the herbicides, modes of action, trade names, active ingredients, number of herbicide resistant weeds for each one. So pick one up from the front here if you would like one.